2 of the 3 days of the 2022 MLB Draft are complete. I'll run down all the players that the Orioles have selected through the first 10 rounds. And then specifically, we'll take a deeper look at Jackson Holliday, the Orioles' #1 overall pick. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, July 19th, 2022, and welcome back in to the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to give you a brief little something on every player that the Orioles have drafted on day 2 of the draft. Those rounds 3 through 10, Orioles picking up 8 more players on the day. And we'll go through just a little nugget on each guy to get to know some of the newest Orioles. Then we'll have a guest coming on the pod. It is Hallie Hart, who covers all things Oklahoma high school baseball. And she's going to join us to talk about the incredible senior season for the Orioles' #1 pick, Jackson Holliday. We'll talk about how dominant he was on the field and what his relationship is with his dad, Matt Holliday, how he plays in off the field, and just in general, we'll get a better sense of who Jackson Holliday is as the Orioles took him 1-1 in the draft on Sunday. So that's all coming up on this episode. But first, just got to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts or right here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on all the platforms. Leave a 5-star rating and a review if you can. It really, really helps out the pod. And again, we thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. And for your first listen today, let's start with day 2 of the Orioles draft. Orioles drafting with the first pick of each of the rounds 3 through 10. Wanted to give you just a little something on each of the guys the O's brought in. Now, we're actually going to start with the final pick that they made on Sunday night, because if you went back and listened to Monday's episode, which you should do, I broke down each of the Orioles' first 3 picks, but a guy's got to go to bed at some point. So did not stay up long enough to recap their final pick on day 1 on Monday's pod. So let's start with pick number 67 in the draft. In the competitive balance B round, the Orioles took Jud Fabian, the outfielder out of Florida. Now, he is a right-handed hitter with a whole lot of power. And Fabian, a pretty interesting story. Going into the 2021 college season, he was projected as a top 5 pick. And many people thought the Orioles might take him with the 5th pick last year that they eventually used on Colton Cowser. Well, Fabian struggled in his 2021 season, had a lot of strikeouts, and dropped from a top 5 player to out of the first round. However, the Orioles apparently had a deal with him where they were going to pay him reportedly $3 million over slot to take him with the 41st pick in last year's draft. But that plan was gone when the Red Sox, 1 pick before that, drafted Fabian. And then the Fabian and the Red Sox did not agree to a deal. So Fabian went back to school, and although he only hit .239, he slugged .598 with 24 home runs in 2022, cut down on his strikeouts, upped his walks, and the Orioles get their guy, taking him with the 67th overall pick. Then we go to day 2 of the draft, and the first pick of day 2 went to the Orioles. And with the 81st overall pick, their 3rd round selection, they went with Nolan McLean, a two-way player from Oklahoma State. Now, he's a right-handed pitcher on the mound and also a power-hitting kind of first base / third base / corner outfielder in the field. Now, he's got a fastball in the mid-90s, and the Orioles announced him as a pitcher. And Mike Elias did say that the O's are going to focus on him pitching, but they're going to let him DH a little bit in the minor leagues, it seems like, and play with maybe him becoming a two-way player in the pros like he was at Oklahoma State. Had a 4.97 ERA with 39 Ks in 25 innings out of the Oklahoma State bullpen on the mound this year. Also hit 19 home runs with a .285 batting average at the plate. Now, he hits the ball hard. He strikes out a ton, so he's got to get that down if he wants to stay as a hitter, but definitely an interesting pickup. We go to round 4, where the Orioles took a catcher, Silas Ardoin, the catcher out of Texas, with their 4th round pick. One of the best defensive catchers in this entire draft, with a fantastic throwing arm from behind the dish. Now, he can hit a little bit. Hit 271 with 12 home runs this year after only hitting 1 home run as the starting catcher in 2021. He's known as a very patient hitter at the plate that draws a lot of walks. And his dad, Danny Ardoin, was actually a big league catcher. This is a Remember Some Guys episode with Danny Ardoin. Played in the big leagues from 2000 to 2008 for multiple different teams, including, this is a real deep cut, he played 5 games near the end of the season with the 2006 Baltimore Orioles, but his son Silas Ardoin joining the O's. 5th round selection, the Orioles go with another pitcher. And now McLean was technically the first pitcher they took. That was in the 3rd round, but he's kind of a two-way guy. The first true pitcher the Orioles take is once again in the 5th round this year. They take Trace Bright, the right-handed pitcher out of Auburn, who was kind of a low 90s guy. And then all of a sudden he gets to the College World Series with Auburn this year and is throwing 96 to 97 while striking out 8 and walking no one over 5 innings in his one start against Stanford in Omaha. Now, he did have a 5.13 ERA as an Auburn weekend starter this year, but 94 strikeouts in 81 innings after he really struggled his first 2 years in college. Definitely an interesting pickup for the Orioles. Good fastball with a nasty slider as well. In the 6th round, the Orioles go with Douglas Hodo III, an outfielder also out of Texas. Now, he makes some ridiculous plays in the outfield, can play all 3 outfield positions, and he hits it pretty well too. Slash 319, 418, 532 this year with 10 home runs. He was top 5 in the nation also with 26 doubles this season. And his dad, Doug Hodo, played at Texas as well, played in the College World Series and played in the minors for a few years, but definitely an exciting right-handed bat that the Orioles got there. 7th round, they go back to the mound. Preston Johnson was the pick, a right-hander out of Mississippi State. They call him Beef. That's his nickname. Now, he did have a 5.47 ERA this year. Not great, but 117 strikeouts in just 79 innings. That is some elite strikeout stuff. It's a fastball, slider, changeup. He was a JUCO guy, played at community college for 2 years before transferring to Mississippi State, won the national championship with them, helped them do that in 2021. And strikeout stuff was good, got hit around a little too much, but definitely stuff to play with there here in the 7th round. 8th round selection, another right-handed pitcher for the Orioles. They go with Cameron Weston, the righty out of Michigan, who had a really interesting year this year. First half of the season, he was a starter, and things were kind of up and down. He had a 2.81 ERA as a starter in 2021. He came into this year looking like maybe the Big Ten pitcher of the year potentially, and just didn't have his same stuff as a starter. So halfway through the year, Eric Bakich, the Michigan head coach, turns Weston into like a fireman multi-inning reliever, and he dominates out of the bullpen down the stretch. End of the year with a 4.74 ERA, but it was much, much better since going to the bullpen. So kind of an interesting spot he's in. Probably going to be a reliever at the next level, and we'll see how high he can move up the ranks. In the 9th round, the Orioles go with an infielder as they take the shortstop Adam Crampton out of Stanford. Now, this pick was a little bit off the board. Crampton was not even listed in the Prospects Live top 600 prospects. Remember, the Orioles took him 257th in this draft. Now, the reason they like him, it's the defense. The 2022 Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. You know who won that award? Well, Adley Rutschman and Maverick Hanley code that award back in 2019. But Crampton wins it as the Stanford shortstop, and he can hit too. A 316 average, just hits for no power, just 1 home run, only 9 doubles. So he's basically a singles hitter, but he has come up big in the biggest moments. Hit 364 in the College World Series last year and went 4 for 6 in Stanford's 2 games in the College World Series this year. So when the lights are shining brightest, Crampton shows out. And the last pick of day 2 for the Orioles, definitely went off the board with this one as well. 10th rounder is the right-handed pitcher Wyatt Cheney out of McLennan Community College, a pick right out of JUCO who had some ridiculous stats at junior college this year, a 3.20 ERA, 122 strikeouts in 82 innings, fastball, slider, changeup guy. But he did start at the D1 level. He pitched at, you guessed it, Oklahoma State in 2020 and 2021, did struggle there before transferring, and now the Orioles get him in the 10th round. So not as many guys in this group that the Orioles are giving big overslot bonuses to, but they don't exactly have a lot of money to play with because it was reported they're giving more than $8 million to Jackson Holliday with the first pick, so they did not go under slot with any of those early selections. But speaking of Jackson Holliday, he, of course, was 1-1 for the Orioles. They took him with the first overall pick on Sunday night. And we're going to learn more about Jackson Holliday as Hallie Hart is going to join us here on the podcast. She is an Oklahoma high school baseball reporter for the Stillwater News Press, and she covered Holliday's entire senior season when he dominated at Stillwater High School this spring. And Hallie's going to join us to talk about his senior season, working with his dad, Matt Holliday, and everything that led up to him being the #1 pick in the draft. That's coming up next with Hallie Hart of the Stillwater News Press. But first, do got to tell you about BlueNile.com, because whether you're ready to pop the question or you're celebrating a milestone moment, find jewelry as unique as her with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. Blue Nile has simple online tools to let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. And if you don't know what you're looking for, or you're just having trouble choosing, Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7, available via phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. So make your moments sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And going on now is the Blue Nile Anniversary Sale. Save up to 40% on classic fine jewelry pieces and 25% on engagement ring settings. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. All right, so we are starting our 2022 MLB Draft breakdown series of all the Orioles picks. And of course, we have to start with the #1 overall selection, Jackson Holliday, who the O's took #1 in Sunday night's draft. And joining us to tell us all about Jackson is Hallie Hart, who has covered Jackson Holliday. She works for the Stillwater News Press, covering Oklahoma State athletics as well as high school sports in Oklahoma. And Hallie, first of all, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on here. Of course, it was exciting watching the draft last night. And so I'm happy to be here and talk about Jackson.
Yeah, so I know you've been covering him for a while. You've been in the area covering sports. I did just want to ask, Jackson Holliday was a guy who, in terms of Orioles fans, we've known that they've had the #1 pick since the end of last season. So it's been a whole lot of building up and people throwing out names left and right. There were probably 10 names that at some point people had a thought the Orioles might take. And Holliday was kind of a later riser because his season was so good in high school this year. So was there a timeline where he went from, hey, Jackson's going to go in the first round, to at what point was it, wow, Jackson Holliday is in real consideration to be the #1 pick in the draft?
It was really amazing to see that progression throughout the season. And I'll say, as far as covering Jackson's career, this was my first season working at the Stillwater News Press. And so I came in for Jackson's senior season, but I'd been familiar with Jackson at Oklahoma State, working for the student paper there, because we knew Matt Holliday's sons, both of them, Ethan being younger, but both of them, of course, expected to be big time MLB draft prospects. And so I was used to hearing that talk, but then really following Jackson throughout the senior season was, like I said, pretty amazing to see that progression. And I know that talking to Jackson and, of course, talking to his dad, Matt, I really was able to learn kind of how Jackson put in all this extra work during the off season, not just in terms of baseball, but also with weight training to get stronger, which was something that I think really elevated his status in the draft. And then with his breakout, I mean, you have someone who has 17 home runs through his senior season. If you look at just the batting averages, the on-base percentage, everything, of course, is just really rare numbers. And so as the season went along, and of course there were scouts around and people following him, I think it really was kind of toward the end of the season where people started realizing, I think he could go #1. Everyone took him seriously as a first-round pick, but I think it was really at that point where he kind of proved himself as the potential #1 pick.
Yeah, you mentioned those stats, and I think this is a question that all fans have about any high school player that gets drafted, because the level of competition around the country, the level just that kids play at, some players will be at big public schools, some players will be at small public schools, some guys will be at private schools, and it all kind of differs. So the question kind of becomes, Tamar Johnson was one of the other players who the Orioles were considering, and one of the knocks on him, whether it was fair or not, is that he just wasn't on that good of a high school team. And in general, like, he wasn't playing the best competition in the country, every day in his high school games. In terms of Jackson being at Stillwater, like, what was the talent around him? And I guess the question really becomes, how much better was he than the other players he was on the field with?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question because when you look at Stillwater's season, it's a little bit deceiving because as far as postseason play, they made it into a regional and then they lost in regionals to Owasso, but that was the team that ended up going on to win state. So it was kind of a little bit of an unlucky postseason draw that maybe I don't think shows just how good the Stillwater team was through this past season, because the thing about it was you had Jackson, but just overall, they were really known for having this power hitting lineup that the offense gets going and then they're hard to stop, because you had Jackson batting second and then right behind him third was his younger brother Ethan, who as a freshman had 10 home runs this season and is already, like I said, being looked at as a prospect. And then behind that, as the cleanup hitter, you had Gage Gundy, who's Oklahoma State football coach Mike Gundy's youngest son. And he had, I believe, 14 or 15. I'd have to check my stats, but a lot of home runs too. And so you really kind of that Holliday Gundy part of the lineup was really what fueled the offense. And so they have several talented players. But with that being said, Jackson did establish himself as someone who was really on his own level. And I think one thing that shows that is through his whole senior season, he struck out only 7 times. And that happened even with facing some high level pitchers, because there's some good pitching in Oklahoma prep baseball right now. And so I think that really kind of shows not just the power hitting, but his abilities to really be efficient and put together some at bats, whether it's a home run or just something he does to put the ball in play. I think that the whole offense, they had depth on offense, but Jackson was really the one who sparked it all.
And then I did want to ask just a little about the rest of his game, because, here's kind of my first question. I know a lot of the times at high schools, guys who are the best player just end up pitching some too. Did Jackson do that at all? Because I know there's other guys who, just in terms of when you're the best player on your high school team, most of the time you're going to end up on the mound at some point.
I never saw him on the mound. And that is interesting because he has that skill set. He has the versatility on offense and defense and everything, but I actually never saw him on the mound. Ethan was briefly on the mound, and I know he talked about how he pitched when he was younger a little bit and then kind of dealt with some arm injuries, and so he moved over to third base then. But Jackson, he was really solid in that shortstop spot. I think that was where the team needed him, and that was where he was able to stay pretty much through the whole season. I mean, that was where he was through the whole season. So like you said, though, with his talent and his versatility, he really is. I know the Orioles general manager has described him as a 5-tool player. 5-tool shortstop is what they expect. And when you look at all those categories, I mean, I think that really is what he's done, because just hitting, I mean, when you see, like I said, his on base percentage, that shows it. Hitting for power, he had the 17 home runs, and then of course running 30 stolen bases, that's something that stands out. And then fielding and throwing, obviously his defense was strong, only 3 errors all season. And so I think just being at that shortstop position was really where he felt comfortable. It would have been interesting to see what happened if they did just put him on the mound, but I don't think they wanted to risk that, especially with the risk of injury or anything. I think they definitely wanted to protect him and keep him at that shortstop role. So I guess it might be interesting to see if he ever ends up anywhere else on the field once he gets into the minor leagues, but I think that he really established himself as a shortstop.
Yeah, that's something Mike Elias, the O's GM, said after the pick was, he feels he is a long-term shortstop with all those tools. But we'll get back to it with Hallie Hart talking about the Orioles' #1 pick, Jackson Holliday, in just a second. But first, just want to stop to tell you about Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market. And from the people who invented the healthy and the tasty protein bar comes the latest gift to your taste buds. You've probably tried the amazing coconut brownie chunk bar, but guess what? Your friends at Built have given coconut brownie chunk the Puffs treatment. That's right, the Built Puffs. If you haven't heard of them, it is the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. It's a marshmallow covered in 100% real chocolate with plenty of great flavors, and it's good for you as well. So stop drooling and listen. They're good for you. Again, low calorie, low sugar, high protein, and all delicious. And these coconut Brownie Chunk Puffs are only here for a limited time. So go to built.com to make sure you don't miss out. And trust me, they are going fast. So head to built.com. And if you would like to try any of their delicious flavors like creamy marshmallow, sweet brownie, delicious coconut, go to built.com again and use the promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Again, that is promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So we're here with Hallie Hart, who is covering Jackson Holliday's just ridiculous senior high school season at Stillwater High School. She's writing for the Stillwater News Press. And Hallie, this is an interesting part of this as well, because I know you cover Oklahoma State, and that's where Jackson was committed to head. I think everybody kind of assumed at this point that he was going to be signing, especially once he got into that number one pick conversation. But I wondered if you had any insight into just kind of what that situation was between him and Oklahoma State, because he committed, obviously has all the family ties there, but there comes to a point where he pretty much knows he's not going to go to college.
Well, as you said, I think that even though Jackson hasn't made an official announcement yet, I mean, when you're picked number one, that's really an opportunity that's difficult for anyone to pass up. And so I don't think anyone, even his uncle Josh Holliday, who's the OSU coach, I don't think anyone could blame him for going ahead and taking that opportunity to start his professional career. But I did have some insight kind of leading up to the draft as far as what that decision was looking like, both from Jackson's perspective and then from Matt's perspective too. And I think one thing that stood out about that is, like Matt and I talked about, Jackson really had the full visual, as Matt said, of what his future would look like, because he had a decision that a lot of guys make, if there's someone who's a top level prospect and someone who is drafted out of high school, that's a common thing to have to decide between high school and college. But I think something that made Jackson's decision unique was not just the fact that he was projected to go so high in the draft, but also the fact that he had grown up seeing both sides of this decision. Because I've heard stories from people when he was a little 3-year-old who Matt would bring around these clubhouses and already impressing people with his swing somehow at that age, which is really just incredible and kind of funny to hear about now that I know him as this good baseball player. But so he started with that and was able to see what the lifestyle of a professional baseball player looks like, connect with other professional baseball players. I know Nolan Arenado is a close family friend and someone Jackson says he looks up to. So he's able to have those perspectives from his dad, from other major league players, but then also he knows what college baseball looks like, because of course, after his professional baseball career, Matt Holliday ended up coming back to Oklahoma State, which is why the family's in Stillwater. And he's a volunteer assistant coach on the coaching staff for his brother, Josh. And so because of that, Jackson has formed friendships with Oklahoma State players. I know he talked about how there's even a couple of guys who were freshmen this past season that he played travel ball with. And so it's gotten to the point where he has connections and friendships on both sides of this decision. But I do think something that stands out is that Jackson said these people were leaving it up to him. Even the OSU players weren't trying to say, oh, we're going to sway you to come to OSU. I'm sure they wanted him to, but when it comes down to it, you've got to be happy for a kid who's drafted number one overall. And I think that's the thing where you just tell him, hey, chase your dream and we'll support you. So it seems like that everyone's really kind of offered that steady support, but then from the friends to his own dad, I think have really just kind of let him make his own decision.
Yeah, and you mentioned his dad, Matt, and that's obviously where people's minds go immediately. He is the son of Matt Holliday, who had a fantastic big league career. And I was wondering if you had any insight into just that relationship, because obviously with Matt coaching at Oklahoma State, he's obviously not Jackson's high school coach, which is some of the case for some of these guys as well. But, just not where does he stand, but kind of, how does Matt fit into the mix? Because you talked about him letting Jackson make his own decision, but we also saw on the draft coverage yesterday, they're getting interviewed simultaneously after he gets picked. They're at the watch party, and it's Matt and Jackson being talked to by the broadcast at the same time. So just how was he, kind of by Jackson's side throughout this season as his name, just as we talked about, just climbed up and up those draft boards?
Yes, I think by Jackson's side is kind of a good way to put it, because he has talked about the importance of him making his independent decisions and not wanting everything to just be a comparison. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore the comparisons between the two and the way Matt has played a role in Jackson's growth. Because while, as you mentioned, Matt was not Jackson's coach at Stillwater High School, he did kind of play that role of behind the scenes coach almost in a way, because they were working together, in the batting cages, working on strength training, all of that together. And so Matt was really someone who played a role in Jackson kind of taking his game to the next level for his senior season. And that's something that Jackson tells you. He always makes sure to give credit to his dad. And I know when I've talked to Jackson, and it's not just him saying, I put in the work off the off season, it's always me and my dad, or, my dad and I did this and all of that. And so his dad is very much someone who's played a large role in his career, not just as a growing baseball player, but also as a person. I know he's someone he goes to as a mentor. And I think it is kind of striking that in talking to Matt and Jackson, they have similar demeanors. They're both kind of quiet, calm, not somebody who's necessarily that life of the party type personality. I know Ethan, the younger brother, is a little bit more outgoing. And I've read that Leslie, Matt's wife, is kind of more that way too. And so I think that's kind of, Ethan gets that personality more from his mom, and Jackson's more like his dad, which I think is fun to kind of see how all those personalities go together. And then, of course, there's two younger kids too. So it's definitely a close family. The Holidays are all about family, is one thing I can tell you. And I think then Jackson has really been able to kind of mirror his dad in some ways, but then in other ways really set out on his own path too.
Well, Hallie, it's definitely exciting, obviously, here in Baltimore to have Jackson Holliday be the number one pick. And, I was texting with some friends and some people who covered the Orioles, and they were texting me back and asking, is Matt going to try and get himself a deal as well, try and make it a package deal for one comeback season. But I'm sure he's got a couple of swings in him left, but it'll definitely be fun to see Jackson here. Hallie, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Jackson Holliday's senior season in Oklahoma, and really, a great baseball family in the area. And he will certainly be making his way to Baltimore soon. But thanks again for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I look forward to following Jackson's career at the next level. So I'll definitely keep up with you and the others who cover the Orioles too.